Season 3 of Call of Duty Vanguard is finally here, and so today I'm going to be breaking down all of the best in-game settings, mainly focusing on graphics to get the best FPS possible with low latency, but also maintaining great visual fidelity. If you do find this video informative or useful, then please do leave a like down below. It really does help out the channel a ton. And also leave a comment if you have any questions that you'd like to ask me. I'll be sure to answer them as quick as possible. Before we jump into it, today's video is sponsored by Blazing Boost. Now, if you are a Warzone or Vanguard player looking to step up their game, then you need to check these guys out. You can select exactly how long you want to hire a coach or a play with pros service down to the hour, so you know exactly how long you're going to be playing for. Really nice and customizable. They've got over 23,000 Trustpilot 5-star reviews, so use my code 4eyes5 at checkout, get a service booked, and step up your game with Blazing Boost. So without further ado, let's get these settings underway for Season 3 of CoD Vanguard. Now, I haven't done a video on settings for CoD Vanguard since the release of the game, so a couple of things have changed. I've learned a lot more having played the game since then. So let's jump into the settings. This is going to focus mainly on graphics, so what we'll do is we'll start there. After I've done the graphics, I'll jump into some other settings along the top that I think are quite important, but this is really focusing on FPS optimization, so it's all about graphics. So starting off, display mode. This is going to be a case-by-case basis. You're going to pick between full screen and full screen borderless. If you're going for pure best FPS, lowest latency, full screen is the one you want. It's going to mean that there is nothing else being rendered in on the screen when the game's maximized and running, which for most people who are actually tryharding, playing ranked, whatever, that's going to be your best bet. It also means that you just get better latency in general because you've got that exclusive full screen running, and that's really the main focus of this. If you want to go on full screen borderless, you can do that. It will give you a quicker alt tab to actually change between screens. If you're a streamer, if you just multitask in general, you can't go wrong with running full screen borderless. For a lot of people, it will feel just as good as full screen, but for others, full screen does just, it's more reliable is the best way to say it. I won't ramble on much more about that, so pick between the two, see which one works out best for you. Full screen is my recommendation. Display resolution, 1920 by 1080 for me. You just want to pick whatever your native resolution is. So if you're running a 2K monitor, you're going to be going 2560 by 1440. If you're running a 1080p monitor like me, you're going to stick at 1920 by 1080. I wouldn't come in here and try and run any other resolutions. There are some other settings we can go down and change later on that will help us gain FPS if we need to by adjusting our actual resolution scale. We do not change it here. Keep it at native. Monitor, just set this to the correct monitor. Don't need to go into that. For me, it's my Elgato because that's how I record my gameplay, but for you guys, just set it to the correct monitor. That should be pretty obvious. Refresh rate. This should be on auto and automatically set it to the correct hertz of your monitor. If for some reason, you know, you're running a 144 hertz monitor and it says auto 60, that means the game's running at 60 hertz. That's not good. You want to be running at the full refresh rate that your monitor supports. For me, that's 240 hertz. For a lot of you guys, it will be 144, or it might show as 143 point something. That doesn't really matter. Just make sure it's set to the maximum that your monitor supports, or as near to it as possible, which for me is 240. Next up, VSync. So VSync is a debated topic. A lot of people will say VSync is good because it gets rid of that screen tearing that you can see on the right. And if you're running a G-Sync monitor and you've got G-Sync running, I have a G-Sync monitor, but I don't have G-Sync running. I don't like using it. Then you can start using VSync. But for most people who are focused on competitive gameplay and trying to have the game feel as good as possible, just keep VSync off. It will lead to far better latency. Having VSync on means your latency goes through the roof. The whole game feels horrible, especially with your mouse latency. Not good at all, and controller latency if you're playing on the sticks. So in general, keep VSync off on both of these. If you do experience extreme screen tearing, then you will have to go elsewhere to figure that out. But for most players, you won't experience that much screen tearing, so VSync can just stay off. Frame rate limit, set this to custom, go to show more, and then I would just recommend for gameplay custom frame rate limit, one of two things. If you've got a decent build and the game runs smoothly overall, you don't have any problems, just max this out. Because you never know what FPS you might hit. You might be in an indoor area in a game where you get a lot more FPS. At that point, you want the game to be giving you as much FPS as possible. If you start having some stuttering problems, for example, you just have a really kind of back and forth frame rate. It's like You're sometimes really low and then you jump to something really high and then it goes back down. Some people's builds just aren't that reliable and they have that effect. Then what I'd recommend is that you put the gameplay custom frame rate limit down to a steady frame rate that you consistently hit. You know, if you're able to hit a certain frame rate for like 50% of the time you're playing, just set the gameplay custom frame rate limit to there. That way you're limiting the amount of that fluctuation. You're keeping a more steady FPS. You can get used to it a bit more. That's what some people might have to do if you have a lot of stuttering. For me, I don't have any stuttering issues. A lot of people don't. Just max it out. Get the most out of your system when you can. Menu custom frame rate limit. There's really no reason to have this unlimited. I know a lot of people do. I like my menu to feel fluid, so I set mine to 100. Essentially, you don't want the game to be using up loads of excessive system resource when it's on the menu. You know, you're not actually in the game, you're not playing. So this isn't actually anything in terms of gameplay. This is just when you're in the menu, don't have the game using up loads of resources, so keep it around 100. If you're running on a 60 Hz monitor, you could turn this all the way down to 60 and just keep it there, which is absolutely fine. Minimized game custom frame rate limit. I set this to 30. This means if I alt-tab out the game and I'm doing something else, it drops the frame rate of the game running down to 30. So once again, it lowers that system resource even more. If I'm alt-tabbing out the game, I don't need it all open, running at maximum performance. It's just not necessary. Aspect ratio. This should just be set to automatic, which will set it to the actual aspect ratio of your monitor. My monitor is a 16:9 monitor. If you have an ultra-wide monitor or basically either of the ultra-wide monitor styles, you'll either be 21:9 or 32:9. You shouldn't really have to change this from automatic. You should be able to just leave it there and it will just look normal. If your game starts looking really weird, it looks stretched in some weird way, or you've got black bars or something, then maybe come in here and try and set it manually. But for most people, automatic works fine. Brightness, I would always recommend that you bump the brightness up beyond 50. I think 50 is actually quite dark. I recommend anywhere between 55 and 60. That's what I run in Warzone as well, and it just brightens up the game, allows you to see in some of those darker corners a little bit better, and I would just ignore this not visible, barely visible, easily visible stuff. It doesn't really actually translate into the game. Just set it higher than you think you need to. If you already have this set to 60, maybe try bumping up to 65. Bump it up by 5 and see if that just makes the visuals of the game pop a little bit more. We move on to display gamma. If you are on a monitor, which most of you PC gamers are, you want this set to 2.2. If you're on a TV screen, you want this set to 2.4. It just chooses which version of the display gamma to actually use depending on what kind of screen you use. I'm on a monitor, so it's 2.2 for me. HDR. If you have a HDR monitor or a HDR TV and maybe you're playing the campaign, you could put this on. But if you're playing multiplayer, which most of you are, that's why you're here on this video, just keep it off. Oh. Try and check for an update. Right as I'm recording. Perfect. Update requires restart. Well, that's annoying. I do love update days. They just perfectly get in the way of making a nice video. But anyway, we're back in focus mode. Put this off. This is a little thing which they put in, which basically means that when you've got the game active, it like makes everything else on other monitors darken down so you can focus on your game. Don't bother with it. It's probably going to be using some more system resource. You don't need to, and it's just not a very useful feature, so just keep it off. Display adapter, make sure it's set to your graphics card. For most people, you'll only have one thing here. If you somehow have your graphics card, your dedicated GPU, as well as your integrated GPU, if you have one of those, or you somehow have 2 GPUs or something weird like that, just come in here and check that you've got the correct thing selected. If you have any problems with the game just sort of stuttering or having problems like that, try the restart shader compilation button here. It will just do that shader installation again, and it ensures that everything's running smoothly. It's a really easy quick fix if you have any problems. On-demand texture streaming, definitely come in here and make sure this is off. This can cause weird packet burst issues. It basically means that you actually stream high quality textures by downloading them. I don't think anyone should be using this. It's really, really useless, and it just uses up actual internet resource and PC resource. It's a whole mess. Don't bother with it. Okay, moving into quality. Let's grind through this pretty quickly. Quality presets. This will just be set to custom because it's set by everything else we're going through. Render resolution. If you have problems with FPS after everything we do, you can come in here and you can turn this down from 100%. So, for example, if I turn this down to 80, it means I'm rendering at 80% of the resolution that I selected before. This is why I said just set your game to native resolution and we can sort it out later if you really need to. Most people won't though. Just set it to 100 and it should be fine when you follow all these settings through. Only turn this down if you really need to. Dynamic resolution, keep this off. What this does is that when you turn it on, you can set a frame rate target. So for example, say I wanted to always hit 150 FPS. Well, if I step into a scenario in the game where the game wants to go below 150 FPS because it's using up a lot of resource, then it will actually lower the resolution on the fly to maintain the FPS. This is not a good idea in general, because if you're setting this, then it means that your resolution is changing all the time. You need to be used to how the game looks. You can't have the game changing on the fly when you're in those difficult scenarios. You're actually in those 1v1s. You can't have the game just suddenly change in resolution. Not a good idea. Keep it off. Texture resolution. I would recommend that you come back to this setting last. And then there's a good reason for that. Basically, texture resolution is purely based on your VRAM usage down here. You see, if I put this to high, I'm using 5460. If I put it down to low, or very low, I'm using 2736. So about, what, that's half? Yeah, about half of the VRAM. Now, I've got an 8 gig card. So based on this down here, I'm going to have no problems running the game at high texture resolution. Now, I run the game at medium because this does have a very, very small effect on FPS, but it also has an effect on the visibility and visuals of the game. I believe that having higher textures makes the game overall look better, and you can play better with the sharpness of textures in the game. So, come back to this after we've done everything else and literally just set this to... Probably, I wouldn't bother setting it to high. Medium and high look pretty much the same, but set it to one of these 3 settings that means you fall within your estimated RAM usage limit. You're not going over your max. That's what I'd recommend for texture resolution. Now, texture filter anisotropic, just put this to high. Anisotropic or anisotropic filtering, typically this isn't listed as very low to high. It's listed on a time scale or an X scale, so like 2x to 16x, and I always recommend that you put this setting on 16x, which is the highest, so equivalent to what we're doing, which is high. It's minimal system resource, and by minimal I mean like there's no FPS difference running this on high, and it just improves how textures look when you're looking at them from non-direct angles. So for example, the floor in this scenario where we're standing, the wall that's at the back, well, that's directly in front of us, so we're getting a flat rendered texture, whereas the floor is actually being rendered at an angle that's not head on, and it improves how all the textures look, makes the game look way better. So put this on high, there's no reason not to. Particle quality level, I put this to high once again because it has very minimal effect, if any, on FPS, and particle quality is actually quite an important feature. If there's certain particles being rendered in at longer distances, or you just need to be able to potentially see through a flare or whatever's being actually exploded in front of you, then having a sharper texture enables you to see through it a little easier. You can see here, this blurry explosion here is far harder to actually see through than this over here. So it's a good idea to have this on high and, yeah, minimal system resources. So that's what I'd like to set it to. Particle resolution. This, I just put it to low because it gains a small amount of FPS, and really the particles look very little in terms of, there's very little difference. Particle quality level, I saw a lot of difference. Particle resolution, I saw very little difference. The only place I saw a decent amount of actual difference was on the flames, like it shows in the pictures here. But it's not an important setting, and you can gain some decent FPS from turning this to low. So yeah, put it on low. Bullet impacts and sprays on, because it's a shooter. I want to see my bullets and impacts. Although it doesn't actually matter. You could put this to off if you want. It doesn't gain any FPS. It's just a nice setting I like to have on because, I don't know, sometimes I like to shoot a wall and I like to see the bullet holes. Oh well. Shader quality. Put this to low. Very minimal difference in terms of the look, if any. I actually really struggle to see the difference here. It's how some of those lights on surfaces look. There's a bit of FPS gain to get here as well, so I think low is the best option here. Tessellation, I would keep this off, just not necessary. you can gain FPS and you really won't notice the difference of not having tessellation on. This is the kind of thing you'd turn up for a single player experience, not for a multiplayer experience. Level of detail, distance, range, along with nearby level of detail and distant level of detail. Shove those all the way to the right. These are important settings. The detail of the structures and the things you're looking at, very, very important, especially at long range, in some of those longer range engagements on, you know, some of those longer maps when you're looking down Eagle's Nest, or you're on Hotel Royale or something like that, and you're doing those long angles with an AR. You want the detail to be there when you're looking at things at range. Same thing up close as well, just keeping that level of detail in general. It's just a good idea to not limit yourself in this area. We can turn down other settings, but in terms of visibility and maintaining visual fidelity, these are very important. Clutter draw distance, we do not need this on long. This is the distance at which small ground elements such as foliage are visible. This is stuff that the game is rendering in for little to no reason, and we don't need it there. So we turn it to short so that the stuff at long range, like little leaves and stuff like that, it doesn't render them in, or the plant in the pot. If anything, if someone's there at distance and they decide to sit behind this plant, not very good cover, you'd be able to see them. So we actually gain an advantage for turning this to low. Volumetric quality level, definitely big FPS gains to get here by putting this on low. It makes fog look a little bit more particly, but it doesn't actually have that much effect or detriment to the visual quality, and you gain a decent amount of FPS from turning this low. Screen space shadows, I'd recommend you keep these off. These are shadows caused by very small things. When you've got your weapon in your hand, the shadow it casts in your hand. All those kind of little shadows, not important. Takes up FPS, we do not need it, turn it off. Shadow map resolution, I would recommend that you turn this to low, but not very low. Shadows are an FPS hog in many, many games, but very low shadows look like poo-poo. So I would recommend you put these on low. If that still looks too bad and you really can't stand it, bump it to medium, but do not go beyond that. There's no need. Medium and ultra shadows look pretty much the same, and you gain FPS by turning them down. So I'd recommend low or medium if you can't stand them. Sun shadow cascades, I would recommend you keep these on low. So these are the quality of the sunlight shadows. So not very important. There's very minimal difference in the shadows, a little bit more blurry by having them on low, but more FPS gains on top. Cache sun shadows and cache spot shadows, keep both of these on. This enables you to store certain shadows in your cache. This uses up more RAM when you use this, so assuming you have like 8 gigs of RAM or more, which most people do, you will gain considerable performance overall in terms of longevity by having both of these settings on, so you can store those shadows for future frames being rendered. Spot cache size, however, I'd recommend you keep this on low so that we are not basically trying to store too much. We're keeping the cache size as low as possible to improve the performance. Spot shadow quality, put this on low as well. Kind of goes hand in hand with the spot cache size. Particle lighting, low. I saw like no difference between turning this to low and ultra, except for a small gain in FPS, so it was a no-brainer. Put this to low. Ambient occlusion, turn this off. Fairly large gains in FPS can be gained from turning off ambient occlusion in a bunch of different games, because it is the soft shadows that is caused when two objects kind of come in contact. It's there's a lot of these shadows in the game. By turning them off, it will make the game look a lot more flat, but the gains in FPS are nothing to scoff at, so I'd recommend you keep this off. And then when you press show more, you want to turn this to low as well, because we're turning that quality down as much as possible. This shouldn't have any effect because we've already turned ambient occlusion off, but it's safe to just turn it to low anyway. Screen space reflection, low, not off. I like to have these on low because I feel like I can gain some advantage in some way from it. A lot of people I do know run this off, but the game actually looks a lot better having these on, and I don't feel comfortable about turning them off yet. I'd say try both of these settings out and see which one you prefer. Most people will probably say off, but I'm going to keep it to low because, you know, I've got this myth in my head that it's going to come in handy someday, having a reflection in the game. Nvidia DLSS and Fidelity FX Super Resolution. These both need to be off. If you need in the future to come in here and, you know, activate one of these to gain some performance, then go watch another video on it. I'm not going to be breaking down these. These are essentially similar to the render resolution that we did at the top, but not something that I would touch, because it's usually not necessary if you follow the rest of the settings. Fidelity FX Cast, we're going to turn this on, and then we're going to come into the show more and go to Fidelity FX Cast Strength and put this to 100. This is probably the best setting in the whole game. This just sharpens everything up. If you think this is too sharp, bring it down to something like 70. I wouldn't go much below that though, because the sharpening increase is insanely good, especially because we cannot turn off anti-aliasing in CoD Vanguard for whatever reason. So for anti-aliasing, I'd recommend you put this on SMAA T2X, not Filmic, because Filmic is just a lot more blurry overall. And then click Show More and put anti-aliasing quality on low. It's the best we can do. We can't turn anti-aliasing off, so we have to keep it on and put it to the sharpest option, along with the Fidelity FX Cast option. Depth of field, definitely off. And then VRAM usage target, put this to the max. If you start to experience any stutters in the game, one of the ways to usually solve that is to bring this down to 85, then to 80, and keep bringing this down until you stop stuttering. But for me, I have no problems running this at the max, giving it as much VRAM as possible in order to achieve the best FPS. And then lastly, in the graphics area, in gameplay, we've got the field of view. Now, I used to run this at 120 and think, you know, I'm a PC player. I want my FOV to be as high as possible. Most pro players run in between 95 and 105 FOV. And the reason for that is a lot of the engagements you have are sort of at that mid-range. There are some close range ones and there are some kind of really far ones, but in those mid to far range fights, having your FOV too high actually makes it so it's very difficult to see the enemy, because you've kind of zoomed out the image a lot more. So 105 is what I'd recommend you start off with. If you think it looks too zoomed in, if you're really just too used to having 110 plus FOV, then you can go and use that. But I've switched to 105 recently, and I've been having an actual much better time in terms of target acquisition. Camera movement, put this to least. We don't want the camera going everywhere when we're running. I'm glad they put this one in. It's very, very helpful. World motion blur and weapon motion blur, definitely off. We do not want these on. Motion blur is the devil. And then Nvidia Reflex low latency. For most people out there, put this on plus boost. If you are in a situation where you believe that you've got a very weak GPU in comparison to your CPU, which not many people do, most people have, in terms of gaming, they'll have a really strong GPU and their CPU will be a bit weaker, so they're CPU bound, then you can see here that CPU bound cases are when you want to use on plus boost. But if you're in the opposite, we're in a GPU bound case, try on. In general, try both and see which one works better. For me and for most people, on plus boost gives you the best latency, the best feeling in general in game. So that's what I'd recommend you start with, but try on a little bit and see if potentially it feels a bit better. Okay, a couple of extra options I want to jump into before we end this video. Firstly, audio. Put your audio mix to night mode, and then put your master volume up a little bit. I'm going to be covering a whole video on this for both Warzone and Vanguard very soon, where I'm going to break down why this is the best audio mix. But for now, just do it and see how much easier it is to listen to footsteps in the game. It's actually mind-blowing, but keep an eye out for that video coming very soon. Next up is in interface. You want to make sure that you've got your FPS counter on in general, because if you don't have your FPS counter on, then you can't go in and, you know, try out some of those settings that I mentioned earlier that will actually, you know, based on your personal preference. You want to be making sure you can actually see your FPS when you're doing all of these things. There's nothing else in here I really think is that important, apart from the minimap shape being set to square so that you can see more on the minimap. I believe this is by default now anyway, but if you have a circle minimap, definitely come in here and change this to square. And I believe that's everything for this video, guys. It's quite a long one, I know, I apologize for that, but I wanted to break down everything as in detail as possible. If you have enjoyed this video, as I said at the beginning, then please do leave a like below. It helps me out a ton. Subscribe for more videos coming very, very soon, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye-bye.